Good morning. Welcome to Black Hat Briefings Day 1. This is PicoDMA, DMA Attacks at Your Fingertips by Ben Bloxell and Joel Sandin. Please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate so we don't have to hear your voicemail. Thank you much.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, everybody, thanks for coming. Welcome to PicoDMA, DMA Attacks at Your Fingertips. Just to say a little bit about us, my colleague Ben Bloxell was a principal security consultant with Montesano and later NCC Group, and he's currently an independent hardware researcher. I was also with Montesano and later NCC Group as a senior security consultant, and I'm a principal at Latacora, and we help startups bootstrap their security practice. Just to give you an agenda about the talk, we're going to give you some background on DMA attacks. We're going to talk about a wireless DMA implant that we developed called PicoDMA. We'll do a deep dive on FPGA, PCI, and DMA engineering. We'll talk about the radio module, hardware and software, try to do a live demo, conclusions, and future work. So what do we mean when we say a DMA attack? DMA is short for direct memory access, and these attacks traditionally involved an attacker that gets physical access to a device, a workstation, or laptop. An attacker targets high-speed expansion ports like Thunderbolt and Express Card on the device and uses hardware to read and write physical memory. When you're performing a DMA attack, you can recover sensitive data from physical memory, like cryptographic secrets and passwords, and you can also make changes to running software on the device to backdoor the target machine, and that can allow you to read files, bypass authentication if the machine is locked, essentially compromise the machine entirely. And there's a lot of great previous work here. I'm just going to cover a few talks, but there's a lot more out there. Joe Fitz really kicked things off sort of in the public sphere of research with his Slot Screamer project. And he took a USB 3380 reference board, weaponized it, turned it into a very stealthy DMA hardware implant. You can see it on the right. It's a PCI Express card. Looks very innocuous. If you install it into a server and you have physical access, you can connect to the USB port and read 4 gigs of memory. Oath Frisk has been working on the PCI Leech DMA attack suite since 2016, and I really can't do it justice in just one slide. The capabilities are amazing. It not only allows read, writes, and searches of physical memory, supports multiple hardware platforms, but it has a whole suite of software implants that you can use to compromise a target and perform various attacks. And it's not just a research project. PCI Leech is very reliable. You can use it on real engagements. It's robust and really a remarkable tool. And there's a series of research presentations by, and I'm going to mispronounce the names, I apologize, Fabien Perigot, Alexandra Gazet, and Geoffrey Cesarni from Synactive and Airbus. And they looked at firmware on HP Enterprise integrated lights out firmware. Identified vulnerabilities that allow them to compromise that firmware from a management network segment, and then they use DMA attacks from the ILO to pivot into the host of that machine. So when I say that DMA attacks are traditionally performed with physical access, this is something that definitely breaks the trend, really groundbreaking research. But not only was it groundbreaking research, they also added integration with PCI Leech and demonstrated how you could perform these attacks using PCI Leech, and we relied heavily on that integration for our own work. So definitely check that stuff out. I also want to mention, keystroke injection tools, HID implants. I think we're all familiar with these. The Hack5 USB rubber ducky is a good example that's commercially available. It's a lot like a DMA attack in some ways. If you have physical access to a machine that's unlocked, you can inject keystrokes, exfiltrate data, compromise the machine. There's been a lot of research in this space, and I'd say the thing that really sets apart recent projects is a greater degree of deception in the design of the hardware itself and wireless capabilities. So Turnip School is a good example. This was a project by Michael Osman, Dominic Spill, and Jared Boone, and they built a USB cable that had wireless capabilities. If you plug the cable into your machine, someone with wireless access to that cable can inject keystrokes. There's the USB Ninja, developed by Vincent Liu, Kevin Mitnick, and folks from ProxGrind. It's commercially available, very similar. The Cactus WID from Luca Bongiorni Really cool wireless keystroke injecting tool, commercially available, and he's also developing the WID Elite, which integrates a SIM800L GSM modem, so you can access it from anywhere. The Maltronics internal keylogger is pictured on the right there on the bottom. It's an internal keylogger. What sets it apart is it's very tiny. It's 1 centimeter squared. It's persistent. You put it into the keyboard permanently. Looks very innocuous, to someone who, to an untrained eye, it might not look like anything malicious, but it captures every keystroke that flows through that keyboard and lets you retrieve them wirelessly. So really a lot of advancements in this space that I think are relevant to the research that we've done. DMA attacks, they're not just, DMA is not just for attackers. It's an invaluable tool for forensic analysis. You can capture memory from a machine and then use tools like volatility and recall to extract the memory contents of running processes. From there, you can look at what files those processes have open, what network connections they're making, and do root cause analysis in the event of an incident. Just to give you a practical sort of end-to-end DMA attack example using PCI leech, Jean-Christophe Delaunay on the Synactive blog has a really nice write-up about a consulting engagement he was on where he used PCI leech, and he was tasked with compromising a hardened Windows workstation, so the IOMMU was enabled. Other protections were in place. He first was able to reset the BIOS to disable the IOMMU, which didn't prevent the machine from booting. Unfortunately, that wasn't part of the measurements that were being taken before the machine booted. Once he was able to boot it with the IOMMU disabled, he physically opened the device. You can see a picture here of that laptop open, connected to an M2 slot in the laptop, connected an FPGA, I should say, and then used the PCI leech tool that I mentioned to patch the memory on that laptop and actually unlock it and log in. So it was a successful engagement from his perspective, and a really cool write-up that you should check out. And just to talk about the goals for this project, at the onset, our goal was to develop a DMA-capable hardware implant, and we wanted it to be small. Our idea was the implant would be persistent, so you would install it once and leave it in place, and we wanted to incorporate wireless capabilities, so you didn't have to have physical access when actually performing the attack. You could access it wirelessly. And just in the interest of time for the initial prototype, we really wanted to use off-the-shelf hardware if possible. And our hope was to develop proof of concept demonstrations of new attack and defense scenarios, and also to release the software and documentation so other researchers will have low-cost building blocks for new applications, offensive and defensive alike. We developed an initial prototype. This is the PicoDMA. As you can see, it's quite small, fits on a keychain, you can wear it as an earring. It's DMA capable, so you can do 64-bit streaming reads and 64-bit writes. And we also incorporate an FPGA-enabled search capability, so the FPGA can actually search for words in memory that may be interesting to you. It's PCI leech compatible, so all the attacks there you can potentially mount using this hardware device, and we built it using commodity hardware. The PicoDMA is highly embeddable. We see here on the right, it's installed in a machine. It's really easy to install. You just need access to an M2 A or E key expansion slot, or you can use adapters to put it into other slots. Fits in small places. Here it's installed in a Intel NUC, which is pretty palatial as far as the implant is concerned. There's plenty of room. That machine is actually sitting next to me here. And the PicoDMA supports out-of-band access, so it doesn't rely on network access on the target machine. If the target machine doesn't have network access, that's okay. The PicoDMA has its own network access. So it's small and self-reliant and hopefully suited to a big set of targets. And so, wireless implants like these, they decouple the act of installing the implant from performing the actual DMA attack. You can install the implant and then weeks or months later actually perform exploitation. And it gives an attacker more possibilities as far as deployment is concerned. Interdiction attacks are a good example. An attacker can intercept a device when it's in transit and powered down and install a physical implant or a software implant for that matter. Plenty of organizations rely on third-party contractors as hands and eyes technicians for working on servers and data centers and so on. An attacker with temporary physical access to a server that unrack it, doing routine maintenance, can install the implant, put it back on the rack, and then that attacker can later use that implant to actually perform the attack. You can imagine scenarios where an attacker may have legitimate physical access to a machine. An example is, an employee that has access to a workstation as part of their job duties, and then they leave the organization. But before they leave it, they leave a little bit of hardware behind. And when that workstation is issued to a new employee, that former employee would then have access to perform the attack. And of course, organizations that are provisioning hardware, they could install hardware, an implant like this, and do remote forensics later on. And the decoupling allows, new attack variations, new variations on existing attacks that we've seen in past research. We don't need access to the machine when it's live anymore. And that means we can capture, ephemeral credentials that may only be in memory at certain times. Examples are, GPG agent loading keys into memory, or SSH agent. Of course, session cookies associated with sessions on the machine are a good target. And it's not an attack that necessarily happens at a single point in time. You can do ongoing profiling. You can collect activity logs from the target, screenshots, stuff like that over time, because the implant stays put. And because you're installing it and leaving it in place, any protections, and there are some in various operating systems disabling external ports when the machine is locked, those protections don't apply in this context. And we've already sort of alluded to some of the key ingredients here. We need an FPGA platform for actually doing DMA. In order to facilitate wireless access, we need a radio module. It's probably not going to be the same device, so we need a way to connect them. Software, obviously. And this brings me to the PicoEVB, which is a commercially available FPGA platform from RHS Research, LLC. Here's a picture of it. As you can see, it literally fits on a fingertip. It's very tiny. And it's an excellent DMA platform. So we have a block diagram on the right. It's commercially available, like I mentioned. It was launched on Crowd Supply. It runs about $220. It has a powerful FPGA on it, Arctic 7 XE7A50T. It's really tiny. It's 2.2 by 3 centimeters. As I mentioned, it plugs into M2 AE slots. So, a lot of flexibility as far as where you can install it. And really important for us is it comes with expansion capabilities out of the box. So if you look at the block diagram, there are multi-purpose I/O connectors and high-speed digital I/O connectors over there on the left side, and so you can interface it with other devices. What it doesn't come with is any actual way to do DMA, so there's a lot of software engineering that goes into that, and I'll send it over to Ben to talk about building the prototype.
Thanks, Joel. Okay. So the basic challenge with this is PCI is high bandwidth, low latency, and PCI transactions can complete in the order of 10 microseconds. And remote communication, of course, we're talking milliseconds. And Wi-Fi, maybe we have enough bandwidth for these kind of transactions, but something like LoRa radio, where the bandwidth is so much smaller, it's hundreds and maybe thousands of bytes per second. So our platform at a high level, it's similar to previous platforms that we use an FPGA to talk to the PCI Express bus. Where we differ is previous platforms basically queue PCI requests on the FPGA, and we do a lot more processing on the FPGA. Yeah, and we provide a simple interface for doing PCI DMA, and we provide a exposure SPI interface. When we were initially thinking about it, we went through a couple of ideas. The initial idea that a lot of people talk about is putting a soft core on the FPGA. And the reason we rejected this idea is it looked like it was going to require a lot more engineering, basically. To get the performance out of a soft core to process PCI packets, you're either going to need to add custom instructions or a lot of on-chip buffering. And since we had a fixed set of functionality, we decided just to implement those instructions directly. We decided still to include a microcontroller in the system. That gives us flexibility with remote communication and potentially updating the FPGA and these kind of things. For a future platform idea, if we used a specialized PCB, for instance, and a lower cost FPGA, which is possible, the price per unit could easily be below $50. So there's definitely room for improvement there. But we wanted to get moving quick, and with off-the-shelf components, yeah, we could make progress pretty quickly. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we require from the PCI spec and what we're going to be using to perform these PCI DMA attacks. I'm going to start off simple. PCI connectors, I'm sure you're all familiar. There's like standard connectors, which are, in desktop and server class motherboards have been for tens of years. Yeah, maybe even over 20 years now. But nowadays you also have the M.2 slot, which is ubiquitous in mobile devices. This is partly from high performance SSDs becoming much more common, but it's also used for things like Wi-Fi cards, which use a A/E key. SSDs use M key. The keying is done by a physical notch. If you've ever looked at the connector, yeah, there's a physical notch that prevents you from putting different PCI cards into different slots. The actual pins themselves are differential pairs of wires. This means if you're sending like a high bit, one wire will contain a high value and the other one will contain a low value. This helps reduce noise, electrical noise and things like that, improve signal integrity. And the devices will perform link width negotiation, which allows basically some of the pairs to not be working. Interesting, this kind of allows you to do to mechanically alter the connectors. So, for instance, if there's interesting cases of people previously wanting to put graphics cards in motherboards that only have a single PCI lane slot, and they've kind of like chopped up. You can do something similar with M.2 connectors as well, where you sand down the notch in between, and then you can shove an M.2 connector in a different slot. But you can also just use an adapter, and there's adapters for all different types of PCI Express forms. And M.2 slots have also different additional interfaces that they supply, so USB, I2C, etc. For instance, the A/E keying that wireless cards use and the PicoEVB that we're using as our base has USB on it as well. So the adapter in the middle of the image there, you can see that it's got an exposed USB header, and that allows you to route back USB to the host. For our cases, of course, we only care about the PCI Express, so we don't care about the USB. But if you do, yeah, you're going to have to read those signals externally. The PCI Express terminology talks about endpoint devices connected to a root complex. That's just your endpoint talking to a host device. It is packet-based, but it looks, when you're working with it, it looks a bit more like a traditional bus, in that you're performing memory reads, writes to memory locations or to I/O ports, rather than just sending packets with data. There's a physical layer and a data link layer. We're going to not talk about those because that's going to be handled by the FPGA vendor provided code. And we're going to just talk about the transaction layer, which sits on top. The other thing to point out is PCI Express is designed for memory transfers, and they're all usually host initiated. But obviously for our use case, we're going to be initiating them on device and getting the completions back from the host. So the summary of this slide is basically there is no security built into PCI Express. That's kind of a valid threat model, right? It's a high bandwidth protocol that's for physical interconnect. It's not normally exposed to attackers or anything like that. But that's why the basis of why PCI Express DMA attacks can work. The only identification it's done is there's a 16-bit physical slot address that's dictated by the host and will be reported back to the device, but is not configured by the device. And there's a device ID, which is read from the device's configuration space. And that is written by the device. And that's why these DMA attacks can actually work, is that it's self-reported, right? You can report any device ID, and a lot of DMA attacks work by reporting device IDs of devices that have special privileges, such as bus mastering, which is the term for being able to initiate DMA requests in PCI. Okay, so transaction layer packets is a bunch of different ones. We only really care about the memory transactions, the read and write to memory that we're going to be initiating from our device, and we'll receive back completions. There's a number of other ones. Configuration read and write TLPs will be going on. Those will be handled by the FPGA that we won't have to code ourselves. There's a number of other requests, such as IO requests. Those are mostly for legacy compatibility. There's probably attack surface there, but it's not something we're going to go into in this talk. So this is kind of an outline of an example TLP. I'm just going to go over some key fields. There's a length field in the top right-hand corner. This is a length of the number of 32-bit words, data payload in the TLP. It's 10-bit, and the length combined with the address mustn't cross a 4 kilobyte boundary, which we managed to do during design. And the annoying thing about working in PCI Express is a number of hosts tend to allow you to kind of work to be providing incorrect requests, and then suddenly they'll decide, okay, you're not working anymore, something's gone wrong with your device, and then they'll shut off access. It makes it very hard to debug issues because it's working and then it stops working randomly. But yeah, so there's lots of kind of small things along the spec that you need to check out like that. The next field along, going right to left on the top line, is the type field. That's pretty self-explanatory. That's just a TLP type. And then there's a 2-bit field, the format field, which just signifies if the payload contains data, and also if the address type is a 32-bit or 64-bit address. So the way the addressing works in PCI Express is if you only want to address either write or read to a 32-bit address, you have to use a 32-bit address. You can't pack it into a 64-bit value. Otherwise, again, it will potentially accept your transactions, but then might decide you're a damaged device or something. The next line down, we have on the right the byte enables. That just selects whether the bytes in the first data 32-bit word and the last one are enabled. And that allows you to do non-32-bit word addresses. So basically, the address that you provide, as you can see, must be aligned to 32 bits. The address counts from the 31st bit down to the second rather than the 0 bit. Skipping tag, if we go over to request ID, the request ID is the physical ID I mentioned earlier. This will be set or relayed from the host back to the endpoint, and then the endpoint should use this on request. Again, this is another thing. You can not provide the correct request ID, and it may work for a while, and then it will stop working. So yeah, good to provide the right request ID. And the tag field is the last field in the middle in the second row. That basically is an identifier that an endpoint can associate with streams of packets or within a particular packet. And it basically defines the ordering used with the PCI specification. So for instance, different tags, the packets completions may return at different times. There's no ordering guaranteed there, but packets relating to the same tag will always come back in the same order. By default, there's a 5-bit tag allowed, so that's 32 different values, but there's extensions that allow up to 8 bits. And it's mostly a performance thing, but it's something we will use. Okay, so now a quick overview of the FPGA concepts we'll be using. FPGAs, if you're not familiar, are synchronous circuits as programmable logic gates. This means you can emulate circuitry on an integrated chip. It runs very fast. They're commonly used for simulation of ASICs and also to work on I/O that's very timing constrained, either very quickly or requires very precise timing. There's a wide range of costs for FPGAs. I've put a few up here. The lattice ECP5 on the left is not the cheapest FPGA you can get. You can get much cheaper ones. And similarly on the right, the Xilinx VU9P is not the most expensive FPGA you can get. The thing they all have in common, these ones, is they all provide the PCI Express tools that we need to do DMA attacks. Obviously, for our case, we can just go for the cheaper ones. The reason why we're not using the lattice ECP5 here is just for tooling reasons, and also obviously the Pico EVB comes with the Xilinx FPGA in the middle there. The reason you don't see more FPGA tooling, or more FPGA, things implemented on FPGAs, it's just they can be a real pain to develop with, as I'm sure anyone will agree who's worked with them. So the way the FPGA works, the device itself has lookup tables. These are similar to lookup tables when you're designing software or something like that. The difference is that they change value according to some clock that's routed along the FPGA. There's also hard cores in FPGA. It's not just lookup tables. And the reason you want these is things that are implemented in hardened cores require a lot less device space and can potentially operate at a much higher frequency. So all the FPGAs on the previous slide have PCI Express controllers, and that will take care of the physical layer and data link layer for PCI Express, which is why we didn't talk about it in the last section. Some implementation, some libraries provided by the vendors will also do the transaction layer processing for you as well, but that's something obviously we want to control ourselves, as we're going to be doing something slightly non-standard. So designing with FPGAs, as I mentioned, can be a pain. The tooling is improving, but feels like a real step back to software development. There are some interesting open source projects such as Yosis and other things out there, but it's still not on par with software design. In particular, the approach you take designing, encoding, and debugging is different, and bugs can be a real pain to discover, as I'll show a bit later on an FPGA. And so the best way to approach this is similar to a software development approach. You want to be writing what's called test benches for FPGAs, similar to unit tests, early on to make sure you verify your behavior. There's two main classes of design in FPGA. There's register transfer level and behavioral synthesis. Register transfer level is somewhat analogous to assembly, in that you're writing very specific design that you're going to know the exact timing and things like that. And behavioral synthesis is more like working with a high-level language. There's trade-offs to the approach, but using behavioral synthesis can be a lot more productive, similar as using a high-level language can be. But often, one of the issues of working with an FPGA is you're quite constrained by what you can fit on there. And so to get the performance and to get the low utilization of the device resources, you often want to work on a register transfer level, which is what we did. Although we used Clash, there's other tools as well, Chisel. These all compile down to Verilog VHDL, which are the RTL languages. And the benefit here is just you get modern language support, and you can test things almost as a software approach before you test it on device, which you can do somewhat with traditional tooling, but it's a lot smoother and a lot smoother. And the other major benefit is some of this tooling can prevent clock domain errors. So when you're running logic on an FPGA, you're often dealing with multiple clock domains. So for instance, for our use case, we have PCI Express running at one clock domain. We're going to have SPI running at a different clock domain, and we're going to have logic in the middle that's running at a third clock domain. If you aren't careful and you're transferring data across these clock domains, you can easily introduce errors such as metastability issues, where signals appear to have different values, different places, and it becomes dependent on, and the values you receive on things become dependent on the physical length of wires in the FPGA, which is obviously not what you want. Traditional tooling does of course allow you report when there are errors along these lines and things like that. But some of this new tooling has specific, for instance, type safety that prevents it, which is useful. The downside of doing this is there's an additional compilation step in the process, which when things go wrong, it can be harder to find out where in the stack it went wrong. Okay, so this is what an FPGA toolchain looks like. This is actually Xilinx Vivado. As I mentioned, they're all proprietary and they all work only for specific devices. So synthesis and implementation are basically the compilation step for an FPGA. Synthesis takes your code and produces a netlist, which is similar to IR in the software world. And then the implementation step takes that IR and makes it device specific to generate a bit stream that you can then program an FPGA with. The unusual thing about this particular view is this is a block view that I think is quite unique to the Xilinx Vivado tool. There might maybe other vendors provide something similar, I'm not sure. The benefit of working, so when we are coding the various modules, we are working at the Verilog, the HDL level, but it can be useful to have a block view like this where you're connecting the components visually, because as you can see, there's quite a few like inputs and outputs on various modules. This is actually not the largest or the module with the largest number of inputs and outputs on the device. And it can be a real pain just disconnecting and connecting things in source code, which just is basically, like writing out the same name. Imagine providing a function argument to like 100 different places, just repeat them doing it. It can be tiring. And this allows you to connect, disconnect wires very easily. And the other thing I want to mention here is you might be able to see it. I'm not sure how large it is. On the right, there's an integrated logic analyzer, and that's how we're going to debug stuff on the FPGA. So yeah, when you have an integrated logic analyzer on the FPGA, you can set it up to provide you waveforms of what's happening on the FPGA. So the waveforms, and I'm not sure how visible that is, but it basically provides you with readings of the values over time on particular wires that you select. And you can set up trigger points for under certain conditions to trigger the integrated logic analyzer to start recording. Because FPGAs run so quick and the integrated logic analyzer uses resources on the FPGA, you're limited to a very small window. It's a lot more painful than kind of printf debugging in the software world, but it's definitely necessary. For instance, if you're sending PCI Express requests and you're not receiving a response back, you might set a trigger on, okay, when we send a PCI Express request, and then it will capture, let's say, 100 clocks worth of data, and then you can look back and see, okay, yeah, I can see my request going out, I can see there's a valid ready signaling going on, but my data was malformed for some reason, and then you can obviously try and trace back. Okay. So that's enough background. PCI meets FPGA. So what we wanted to provide was PCI DMA as a simple interface, right? We wanted to provide as a SPI interface as well. So we only wanted to provide the kind of simple functions necessary. The search function is particularly useful having that on the FPGA because we can massively reduce downstream bandwidth required for the SPI consumer and also potentially what the SPI consumer wants to send out over radio comms. We could add additional SPI commands. It does require more engineering and it can be a pain because we're not working at software level, so you have to design additional circuitry to run additional commands. The commands that we provide are asynchronous. That means you initiate them and then collect the results apart from the write command. So for instance, for the read command, you would send the read command along with a 64-bit address, and then you would send another command asking whether the command had finished, or the read command had finished, and also how much was read, and also the data that was read. So just a quick overview of SPI. This is one slide overview. SPI is pretty ubiquitous in both microcontroller and all electronic devices. It's really simple to implement. I think my implementation for the FPGA is like 20 or 30 lines long, very easy to get moving with. It's also pretty decent performance. It runs at 20 megahertz. That's so you get like 20 megabits. The FPGA is obviously way more bandwidth than that, but it's not insubstantial. Allows us to get data off the FPGA and onto the microcontroller. There are other options, such as I2C and UART, but SPI was pretty easy to get started with. The other thing to note is these are master-initiated commands. So that means when we want to send a command from the microcontroller to the FPGA, we, in our case, in reverse to this diagram, we raise the slave select line, and that tells the FPGA, okay, there's a command coming, and then we send out and receive bytes according to some clock that's also sent along from the microcontroller to the FPGA. Okay, so this is an overview of the what's on the FPGA itself. Each box here is an independent state machine because it's a circuit. They're all running at the same time. So to start off, the red areas in the top left and bottom left that's the PCI Express clock domain. So there's a transition there from red PCI clock domain into the main logic, which is all in the white domain. And then similarly on the top right, we have the blue arrow, which is the SPI clock domain. Yeah, so basically the SPI interface is very simple. It takes a 1-byte argument, which is, or 1-byte argument and 64-bit arguments. The first byte, sorry, is the command identifier. The SPI module in the top right, that basically takes the bit stream and assembles it into bytes. The command processor assembles those bytes into commands and with their arguments. So for in the case of a search command, the command will be passed to the search and /probe controller. Obviously, it's initiated by the commander, and the search probe control itself will take that command and split it up into a bunch of windows and pass it on to a number of different search controller units. This is mainly for performance. It can be that certain tags, certain requests will be like fail or stall, and if you have different tags associated with different regions, you can get better performance and pipeline it all. Those search units themselves contain a little bit of state according to like where they are in memory, and also a window of what they've seen, so they can collect search results. The search controller and the search units will generate TLPs, PCI TLPs that will be passed out to the host. And then similarly, we receive back TLPs in the top left, and we have a stream reassemble state machine. Basically, when you're receiving TLPs back, as I mentioned earlier, for one particular tag, they will be ordered, but it can be that there's data missing and failures, and obviously our search controller and read buffer, they expect continuous streams. So we try and reassemble into continuous stream, and also we can send out more TLPs if we think we've missed data or something like that. And we can also tag the data stream with useful information, such as the tag that's associated with the data stream and how many bytes are remaining in a particular request. So for a read request, it just gets passed on to the read buffer. The reason we have a 4 kilobyte read buffer is there's really no reason to have to ever read less than 4 kilobytes, even if the SPI command only wants a single byte. The PCI Express is so much quicker that we can just fill a 4 kilobyte buffer, and there's no reason not to. Okay, so there's a number of issues we had during this. One was compiler-induced metastability. Basically, because we'd added an additional compilation step, there was a case where some of our logic was getting optimized out. So this relates back to how those different clock domains and passing data between different clock domains. We'd done the correct approach of double reg string data, which is what's required to remove metastability. But there was a case, and it maybe was a user error, but it could have also been a compiler error that was removing or optimizing, let's say. I think it was shifting how the register, it was retiming some of the registers. So what happens when you have metastability is you have these issues where you can test a value. Let's say x is equal to 1. You test it x equal to 0, and a difference branch will be taken. Instead of y being assigned 0, it's assigned 1, and it's basically due to the result that actually happens is dependent on the physical characteristics of the FPGA, where some wires are like slightly longer, and this shouldn't happen, right? It's a bug, of course. There's also like many other pain points. One is kind of the Indian madness of working with encapsulation inside encapsulation inside encapsulation. Dealing with different endianness is obviously a very common problem, but as we build up encapsulation layers, it just becomes as almost as someone has tried to trip you up, really. So for instance, when you're writing a 64-bit address, 64-bit value to 64-bit address, you'll write the high bits of the address, then you write the low bits, and then you write the low bits of the data, and then the high bits of the address. It's backwards, right? Which, it's not a difficult thing, but it definitely tripped me up. So, yeah. And there's numerous other things that can trip you up. So, for instance, previously I talked about the length in the address not crossing like a page boundary, a 4 kilobyte page boundary. And also, as I mentioned, having that stuff not fail immediately, having it fail like after you've made some requests can be a real pain in debugging those issues. Yeah. Okay, so I'll hand over to Joel now for integrating with the PyCom module.
Thanks, Ben. Awesome. So as we know, there's no radio on the PicoEVB, and we needed a second device to handle communication with the outside world. And we settled on the PyCom family of microcontrollers for developing our prototype. They run MicroPython, so they run an embedded Python interpreter. The idea being that we would drive DMA via SPI, talking to the FPGA, and expose a TCP server that supports reads and writes of physical memory. And PyCom looked to be a perfect candidate for this implementing this prototype. Python's easy to develop in. The PyCom family has modules that include up to 5 different radio technologies. So you have 802.11bgn, LTE, LoRa, and others. It's easily expanded via SPI, which is what we ended up using, I2C. You have lots of pins available for GPIO. Some of the other platforms we looked at were smaller, but they just didn't have enough pins. And it's pretty tiny. It's not as big as the PicoEVB, but close, 5.5 by 2 centimeters. But there are also challenges working with the PyCom in this context. We're trying to support 64-bit reads and writes, but the PyCom has an extensive dual-core LX6 CPU. It's a 32-bit architecture, so you can't natively represent 64-bit values, something to account for. Memory is naturally limited, 4 megs of RAM, 8 megs of flash. Even though you're developing in Python, you have to be careful with data copies. Heap fragmentation can affect the stability of the device, and we don't want it timing out, not being accessible. And we're relying on SPI, which is compared to PCI, comparatively low bandwidth. But none of these were deal breakers. Our software accounts for these challenges. And just to give you sort of a visual representation of the software stack on the radio side. So Ben was talking about the purple square, the PicoDMA. We're communicating with that over SPI. And then if we follow the bouncing ball, we have more complex layers for communicating with the PicoDMA. We have a raw SPI module, SPI.py. It supports fixed length reads and writes and 32K searches over memory, which is a value that we found stable, but we're hoping to increase. There's a more complex module, SPI util, that supports block-based reads, writes, and searches. So it allows you to operate over larger ranges of memory and sort of abstracts away the fixed block sizes of the FPGA itself. And the last piece that we implemented that was really important is streaming reads and writes. So basically, we have a SPI DMA object that takes a socket and shoves data out on it in response to read and write requests. And I mentioned earlier, we have a server thread that takes inbound read and write commands in the format that PCI Leech sends with the raw TCP device. So we can point PCI Leech at this thing and start reading and writing memory. In terms of connectivity, just throwing this in as a wiring guide. In the top right, you see the PicoEVB. That's the back of the board. There are general multi-purpose I/O pins on the bottom. They're oriented with pin 1 at the top, and that connects to the associated pins on the PyCom. You can get wires on DigiKey that are quite long, so it's flexible in terms of where you deploy it. And you'll notice that the VN pin is red, and I'll tell you why. There are some fun gotchas as far as integration goes. Connecting the 3.3 volt pin on the PyCom to the PicoEVB, as you'd expect, would kill the PicoEVB, and I don't recommend doing this 2 days before the conference. Don't pull a Joel. Code uploads often die, and the PyCom becomes unbootable, and you'll want to have a tool handy. In the bottom right, I have my tool that I made, precision craftsmanship, and kind of representative of my state of mind throughout this project. You can hold pin 12 high and boot into recovery mode. End up doing that a lot. The wireless configuration is brittle and dangerous, so be careful. And now let's try some live demos. So we have the NUC box that I mentioned up here. It's running Ubuntu 16.04.06. We have a 480.58 generic kernel, which is supported by PCI Leech. It's a soft target. VTD is disabled. We've disabled kernel ASLR, not a defense against DMA attacks by any means, but it does give us reliable offsets for expedience in the demo. And this machine's happens to be air gapped. There aren't working drivers for that kernel version that are packaged, so it has no connectivity other than the PicoDMA. So let's give this a try. All right, so we will start by connecting. Oh, shit. Sorry, shoot. How do I do that? There we go. Awesome. Okay, so we've connected to the radio itself. We're going to log in. Black hat password. Here goes nothing. Good. And now we have a Python REPL. So now we will run our demo. So far, so good. Awesome. So I'm going to bump up the font size a little bit, and we'll get started. So we have a little basic system information. The important thing here is note that the heap is quite small, 400K. We have a little bit of information about the device itself. It's running at 160 megahertz. Here's the pinouts. This is configurable on the PyCom side, which is useful. We have a server running, and seems to be alive. Is running is true. It's a good sign. Now we'll get into actual communication with the FPGA. So let's test SPI connectivity. And we're running 1,000 trials, and we have a failure rate of 0, which is good because during development, we did have failure rates that were higher. Do a quick read of memory. Seems to be working. Now we're going to find the base address. Sorry, I hit tab there. Finding the base address of the kernel, and we're using search to do so. So that seems to be working well. That's a good sign. Now we're going to do a second read of the first page of the Linux kernel. I'm going to skip PCI leech integration because of time, but we'll see PCI leech in a second. But we can also read and write using PCI leech. And now let's try a write to memory. So nice quiet location in kernel memory, all nulls. Now we will do a write. Here you see pretty crude black hat logo. And okay, the device seems pretty healthy. So let's move into something a little more interesting. We're actually able to compute the offsets that PCI leech requires FPGA side, but in the interest of time, I'm supplying them on the command line. And now we're trying to load a kernel mode implant. Takes a minute or two. I think if we look over here, yep, we got activity here. Reads and writes, looks healthy. It's a lot slower here than it is elsewhere. And there's our first write. Okay, good. So here's the offsets that we're using. We've inserted code into the kernel, and it looks like PCI leech is happy. So we've now compromised this air-gapped machine, and now we're going to pull sensitive credentials using this software implant. PCI leech, of course, doing the heavy lifting here. So we'll start with some user credentials. That seems to be working. I think we only have a minute and a half left, so I am going to switch back to slides, but long story short, pulling credentials works. We can do whatever we want at this point. All right, so just some quick takeaways. DMA implants are more flexible, as we saw, give us new variations in attacks. The Pico EVB is definitely a great platform for DMA research, and we dealt with plenty of challenges developing a working prototype, but we were able to overcome them. We're planning to release all our software. Check out github.com, PicoDMA. The radio software should be up there today. I just haven't posted it yet. FPGA software is coming. Ben's just going to clean it up a little bit. We do have a PCI leech client that you can use with the radio, and other useful tools that we've developed. And Ben, we have 40 seconds. Can you just pull the terminal up again? Let's just see if it worked, just so you guys know we're not pulling your leg. Yeah, okay. So here we have AWS creds pulled from the device. And 30 seconds, so I don't think we have time for questions now, but there is a follow-up room, and we're happy to do live demos and answer questions there. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Ulf and all the other researchers I mentioned.